I think we might have a quorum here, so we can get started. Welcome to the Amherst Historical Society's October 21st History Bite Lecture. My name is George Naughton, and today we are featuring our consulting curator, Ms. Diana Lempel, who has been working with the museum's collection since May. She will lead us in an interactive presentation focusing on the lives of the objects in the museum's collection. And take it away, Diana.
Hi, it's great to see you all. Those of you who don't have your camera on, I invite you to turn it on if you feel comfortable to do that. I want to start by just saying thank you to the board of the Amherst Historical Society and History Museum. It has been just a great pleasure and honor to work with this collection over the course of the past months. I've learned a lot. I've really gotten to spend a lot of time with the objects, and it's been a pleasure to work with this community of volunteers who run this institution for their town. And I hope that what we'll get to do today a little bit is reflect together about what a community and a collection have in relationship with each other, and what the community of a collection is as a group of relationships. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some stories about some of the objects that I've really loved in the collection. And then we're going to talk about objects more generally and about what again, like I said, the Amherst Historical Museum's relationship with collecting might be in the future. So I'm going to share my screen. Behind me is the Emerson room of the Stronghouse, which currently is decorated as if someone in the family were in mourning. We did this for our events last weekend about grief and mourning, and they will continue. This setup will continue to be up for the next 2 weeks. And behind me is the curator's table, which is sort of was my space to sort of think out loud with objects for visitors. So it has a mix of objects together that speak to the idea of grief from really different angles. And one of the things that I like to think about is how objects can be in conversation with each other. So that's where my imaginary body is, and my physical body is in my study in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. Okay, so I wanted to start with a definition, or maybe an exploration of etymology is a better way to say it, for the word curate. My position this summer has been curator or visiting curator at the museum. And when I think about curating, I am thinking about these layers of meaning. I'm thinking about the idea of taking care. I'm thinking about the idea of paying attention or giving attention as a kind of care. I'm also thinking about the idea of having spiritual charge of something, the idea of a curate in a religious setting being a related word. I, as a curator, have a relationship with the unknowable side of what both the community that's related to my collection and the objects in the collection. There is a stewardship that is more than physical, and I'm going to be exploring that idea with you all. The word that I've been thinking about to talk about this practice of curating as being about caring and caring for the more than physical is the word aliveness. And I think of aliveness as being the property of being animated by something that connects an object to the world beyond it. And when I was thinking about how to talk about this and sort of communicate it in a way that would make sense, I thought about the Velveteen Rabbit. Do you all know the Velveteen Rabbit story? Can I get some nods or some thumbs up?
Absolutely.
So the Velveteen Rabbit is about, like, someone sort of summarize or say what the main point of the Velveteen Rabbit is to them.
I remember it was a story about a small toy Velveteen Rabbit who wanted to become real and couldn't figure out why some of his or her owner's toys seemed to be real. And the process of becoming real wasn't, I think, a big adventure, but it was a process of being used and being loved by the toy's owner.
I love that. You brought two, I see Bonnie clapping. You brought this sort of like two key verbs, being used and being loved. And that those are the things that made the Velveteen Rabbit become real. And I think of being used and being loved as being the guiding principles behind my relationship with objects. I started out in urban planning and studying urban planning and historic preservation about 12 years ago. And I became really interested in the difference between buildings that are thought to be, that are held static, and objects that continue to be used. And the idea of use being a principle. And I also was really interested in how something looked and how something is used are different sometimes. So, like, what does it mean if you have a church building? What does it mean to keep it looking the same but turning it into a house versus keeping it or allowing it to look different but continuing to allow it to be a community gathering space, as an example? These were the kinds of questions that kind of preoccupied me as a young graduate student. And this Velveteen Rabbit principle with objects, I feel like, is really similar to those questions that I was asking about buildings and cities, which is how do I as a curator and how do we as a community have a relationship with objects that allows for using and loving? And I was thinking of some other verbs, and one was listening and another was looking after. And so these are sort of the verbs that I use to think about curating. And that's really, I don't know, how does that feel to you all? Does that sound like, oh yeah, that's what I imagine curating is? Or is that like, oh no, that's different from what I thought? I'd love to hear.
Well, as a longtime curator, all I can say is I'm taking notes, Diane. I think you've added a dimension, and it's the important dimension that objects have multiple stories. It's how they're created, how they're displayed, how they're used, and how they're understood. And it's this latter understanding by the viewer that I think you're bringing to light so nicely.
Marla.
Yes, I'll second that. Taking lots of notes too. And I would add one thing that comes to mind that you flagged is what I think is an evolving definition of curatorial work, where I think it used to be a lot more evaluative, the whole good, better, best thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm happy to think that the field is moving away from that part and really to a more encompassing understanding, and not necessarily like, curatorial competition between artifacts, which is the very best of its kind, and that element to it.
Yeah. Ludmila, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes, and everybody calls me Lou, so it's fine.
Hi, Lou.
Just wanted to say that I really appreciate everything that you've been saying. And the one thing that came to mind also was that at a certain point, buildings also become different. They're they're part of a collection of the built environment the moment they're built, but their life cycle does shift and change as a material object. And a curator also brings a level of knowledge. It's that curate that, spends time understanding the spiritual or the non-physical qualities of objects, so that they could bring a certain amount of understanding and knowledge to the curation of those objects.
Yeah, I love that. So you kind of brought up two things. One is that, or a few things actually. One is the idea of time and how caring, using, loving, listening, how these things happen over time. And one of my practices as a historian is oral history. And one of the things we talk a lot about with listening and stories is that you can't stop them. You can't look around you can't hop around in them. You have to sort of start from the beginning and go to the end, because they take place over time and in time. And so all of these processes take time. And what happens to the Velveteen Rabbit over time in this story? Does anyone remember? Becomes more real, and
I remember the rabbit becomes frayed at the edges. Themes start to open up, things like that.
Yeah. So that brings up a really important tension, which is, how do you care for something in the sense of providing medical attention or cure, while at the same time loving it to bits? One of my sons has a bunch of stuffed animals, which he sleeps with all of them all the time. And my other son, with a more evaluative eye, was looking at them all and saying, this one is less fuzzy than the others. And I said, well, do you know why that one's the least fuzzy? And he said, no. And I was like, that's because that's the one he's had and loved the longest. And the more he holds it, the less fuzzy it gets. And that's the tension of curating, right? Is that when you love and use something, by your love and care and attention, you are causing its physical presence to degrade. And so striking the balance between using and loving, and caring and protecting, which I feel like protecting is often the way that caring for is often used with curating, that those are intentions sometimes. And so I think that brings me, does anyone else have something to say on this topic before I move? Okay, so that's sort of like the premise with which I work as a curator. How do you use and love? How do you honor change over time while also protecting things that you don't want to lose by loving and using too much? So, because I guess there's like a basic assumption here that I haven't even said yet, which is, why do things go into a museum in the first place? Why do I even have this job? What is the collection even for? I think this is the question I asked the board on the very first day. It's like, what is this for? Elisa,
thank you.
Elisa.
I was at one point one of the people who gave tours back in the 70s of the Stronghouse. Awesome. And I know that at least some of the things there, families in Amherst had, from their ancestor or whatever, and gave them to the museum. And in some cases, the museum is still glad to have them, and in other cases, they probably aren't. But I think most of us do have a sense that some things in our lives should be preserved for future generations to know about and to see in reality, not just a picture of it or a description of it or something like that. And some people are able to keep those things in their families, and others either can't or feel like they should be more widely shared.
I thought that last bit was so useful. This idea that, well, first of all, I loved the words you used for future generations to know about. Mm-hmm. Know about feels like such a great turn of phrase for this. And the idea that, why might someone give it to a museum rather than handing it down in their family? Well, one answer might be because they can't. And another answer might be because they have a sense that it's bigger than their family. And Gigi sort of brought up this idea that curatorial work in the past had an evaluative approach, and it sort of tried to use objective standards to decide what the best example of a certain kind of object was, so that it could evaluate whether or not an object transcended the family of its origin, right? But in a local historical society, I think that works a little bit differently. I think that one of the things that we as a board have been talking about a lot this summer is the idea that it's actually the particular and not the objective that makes local stories really meaningful sometimes. And that it might not be about the nicest version of something, but instead we might be most interested in who the story's about and the specific people. So this idea that, but by some standard, someone is deciding that an object is going to transcend the value of the family of its origin, or the household of its origin, or the workshop of its origin. Can any of you suggest some reasons why an object might transcend the value of the place of its origin?
Well, it could be the best example.
Mm-hmm.
Or in Amherst, there's certain families that became well known in town and were important in town and stuff. And so if it belonged to one of them, people tended to assume. I developed a fascination with Mabel Loomis Todd myself, but thanks to the History Museum.
Join the club. Yeah.
Right.
I guess I've joined the club.
Right. And in other cases, like Civil War uniforms or something, I think people felt like it was part of history, and this was a local part of history that we participated,
Right. This idea that this is a local version of a bigger story, and we want to express what our local experience of this bigger story is.
Mm-hmm.
Elle?
Sorry, hi, Lisa.
Hi, Lisa.
Thank you. Yeah, so the connection to the who, I was thinking, of course, again, depending on who it's connected to, this item, but I was also wondering if perhaps if the item is not the norm or unusual and it somehow stands out, right? Doesn't have to be the best or the most excellent or whatever, just something perhaps different, something unique. I don't know, I'm a retired teacher and I love taking students to museums. So this is a fascinating conversation about who gets to decide what appears on a shelf or in a museum or a home that's historical. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I love, so uniqueness, right? Which sometimes has to do with like the unique mind or hand of a particular person, or maybe something that someone had a unique eye to. So, and then there's also the very ordinary, which local historical societies tend to emphasize more than big museums often. And the reason for that is we're interested in everyday life. We're interested in everyday life in this particular place. And another thing that often is a reason for collecting is obsolescence. We don't use this anymore. I've never seen one of those. The Mr. Green, who has the typewriter shop on that street, the main street.
North Pleasant. It's on North Pleasant Street.
Thank you. Mr. Green's typewriter shop is a good example of a collection that serves the purpose of showing, allowing people to know about things that they might not otherwise know about that are obsolete. So does anyone else have anything that they want to think aloud about why things go into collections before I talk about some of my inspirations and start showing some objects?
Well,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say there certainly are things that I wish we had more about in terms of everyday life, like Baby Carriage Brook, where there was apparently not the only place that made baby carriages in the 19th century of Amherst. It's really hard to understand how that brook that's easy to step across provided enough power to do anything, you know, and it would be marvelous if we had plans of facility or something, you know. And well, and similar other small industries in the area, you know. We have pictures of the hat factory, but, you know, littler things, so.
That's a really good point. And the idea that, you know, what you can collect is sometimes like a synecdoche, like a small stand-in for a larger place or a larger landform, right? That you can't document, you know, the changing of a forest or the changing of a waterway or a watershed. And we're acutely aware now of how those things do change over time. And it's really interesting to think about how you might go about telling the story of a place as it changes with only what you can collect and fit on small shelves. So thank you. That's really a useful thing to sort of bring up and flag. So, okay, so I have a lot of books. I had a reading list that I shared through the library and the museum earlier in the summer. I tend to read widely across genres in a way that inspires the work. But two sort of constants for me that really reflect this approach to curating that I've talked about is Indigenous knowledge and women's history. And also Afrofuturism and Black fiction is another one. I just didn't have a good book image. But the reason for these for sort of pulling out these specific fields is that women's history kind of has, or all of these fields kind of have at the center of them a tension similar to the one that I described, which is that historically the collections the collections of written words that professional historians have used in order to tell historical stories have not had the sources needed to tell the kinds of official stories that are told about men in high positions, white men in high positions. And this absence in the written record makes a certain kind of imagination necessary. And this imagination is sometimes text and sometimes subtext in women's history. And the thing that non-historians get to do with this text or subtext is to imagine into it. And sometimes historians do too, but they're not quite sure how that fits with the objectiveness of their field. The other night in my book discussion with the Jones Library, we were talking about how a historian creates trust with their reader. And one of the ways a historian creates trust is by having citations. And so not having citations becomes a challenge in that field. And so one of the reasons why I like to read outside the field of history is because I get to see other ways of building trust and other ways of working with this gap at the center of the knowledge. And a related phenomenon that I find in Indigenous scholarship is the idea of traditional knowledge, that there is another pathway of knowledge that exists that is wholly intellectually distinct from academic knowledge as it's developed in Western society. And Black scholars write about this too. And that knowing that this entirely distinct knowledge that has its own methods and its own language and its own validity and its own ways of building trust, to me has been really valuable, both in the sense of knowing that I am a guest on this land and I want to understand how the land that the land under my feet has been known for millennia, and also as a way to think about the gaps that exist in the way academic knowledge is constructed. So those are some of the like guiding principles. And like I said, fiction is really important for this. And it's one of the reasons why sometimes I'm not a curator, but I'm an artist or a writer, because I think you need all these different tools in order to really get at the conceptual understanding of objects that I just described with the Velveteen Rabbit. So does anyone have any questions about that? That was sort of my annotation, or like my bibliography page. And I'm happy to talk about that more, but I'd really like to share some objects with you. Is everybody ready for that? Okay. So in a local history museum, you have this beautiful thing, which is that many of the objects came from people who knew each other. And the objects know each other too. And so I want to just share a few stories of how I've listened to objects and found surprising correspondences across objects or between objects and my thoughts that sort of speak to me about the way the objects themselves and the collection are telling me what they need and how they need to be cared for in order to be used and loved and brought to life, like the Velveteen Rabbit. And one of the things that I think is unspoken in history work, so everyone jokes about the ghosts in their museums, right? But I think we all know, and I've had so many conversations where this is, again, subtext, that there's something to it, that something to it, or that something is the aliveness of our objects in our collections. And so I'm just going to share some stories from my experience with Amherst History Museum that kind of will illustrate this, and also show you, like I said, how I listen to that aliveness and try to bring it to life. So the first is, this is a China set that I just found my last time at the museum. So apologize, these pictures were taken at dusk in the collection, back in the stacks and storage. This is a set of china that belonged to, these originally belonged to Roxana or Roxy, a bunch of different versions of her name, Kos, and it was given to her granddaughter, Mabel Bell Ellen Whittier Churchill. But it wasn't given directly. As you can see, the grandmother and the granddaughter never were alive at the same time. The grandmother died quite young. And according to the accession notes that we have, it was Olive Downs who gave this set to Mabel. And this set of china looks like it might have related to temperance and temperance tea parties, although it's a little bit early for sort of the big social temperance tea parties that happened in Britain. But there are hope and faith and charity on these objects. And I thought this was really interesting because Roxalana was from a farm family and Mabel's father was a farmhand in Maine, but she married a Amherst professor, and that's how she came to settle at Amherst. And they lived at the Dell, which is the house that Mabel Loomis Todd lived in when before they moved into the observatory at Amherst. And so here we have this hand-me-down of generations of china, and that's all that I've been able to figure out about it so far. But I did know that I have a photo of the Dell from when Mabel Loomis Todd lived there. And when I was looking at these photos of the Dell when Mabel Loomis Todd lived there, Mabel Loomis Todd, for any of you who don't know, she came up earlier, she was the founder of the museum. And she was also the first editor of Emily Dickinson's writing. She was a very prolific artist and writer and lecturer. And so this is a photo of the house when she lived there, the house that this set would have one day lived in. So this set lived in this house when the next owner lived there. And in this picture, I noticed this plate, which I believe is this plate in our collection. And this plate was painted in the summer of 1883, which was a summer that Mabel Loomis Todd spent in Hampton or Hampton Beach, New Hampshire, right on the marshes there. And she went there and she was out of touch with her lover, Austin Dickinson, for the whole summer because their relationship was new and his wife, Sue Dickinson, was not happy about it. And so they were pretty much out of communication. And all that remains of that time period in their relationship was 2 letters from Austin to her, one of which in which he begs her to write something because he couldn't stand the fact that they'd agreed that she wouldn't write him anything. So we know a little bit about her state of mind in which she painted this. She's pining for her lover. She's also on the beach. And somehow, because this is what happens in these collections, it's connected to Roxolana Coes in the early 19th century and this sort of modest set of a farm laborer's wife. So that kind of like thread of thinking is the kind of conversation that objects get to have in a collection that all comes from the same place in the same community. Here's another one. This is a favorite of mine, and I've talked some of your ears off about it already, so please permit me. So this is a painting of Caroline Phoebe Dutch Hunt, painted by local celebrated painter Erastus Salisbury Field. She was the wife of the minister at First Parish Church, at First Church. Yeah. Okay. And their portraits were found out of frames and rolled up in a home in Ayer, Massachusetts. And hers was in a basket in an attic, and his was inside a grandfather clock. And they were brought to the museum, and the attention given to them mostly has been about the fact that Field painted them because these are really lovely. It's a pair of them. Her and her husband are both painted, and it's a beautiful pair. And he is a well-known painter. And these are, I could go on and on about how much I love the doilies and the ruffles on her bonnet, but I was really excited to discover that we actually have an example of this woman's work in the collection. So after her husband passed in the 1840s, she became the schoolmistress at Amherst School. And she was a teacher and taught there for the rest of her long life, raising 5 children. And one of the things that she did was make this missionary tree. And this missionary tree is a data visualization of all of the missionary work done in Christian history from the time of Jesus preaching the gospel to the present. And there are some troubling aspects to this, to put it mildly. All of the missionary work to the indigenous people of the United States, or of this land of Turtle Island, are on here. Missions around the world are here. But I think it does something really interesting to envision this as a real physical living tree. And so this missionary tree, there aren't too many copies. There aren't too many versions of this in collections. And when I realized that this object went with this portrait, it was a very exciting reuniting, especially because she was cataloged as being Mrs. Reverend rather than as being herself. And she had this professional career that deserved recognition and also fit into a body of research that I've been doing on women's infographic making in education in this time period. So another local woman who was doing this kind of work was Ora White Hitchcock, whose collections are at Amherst College. She was the wife of the first state geologist of Massachusetts, Edward Hitchcock, whose name is familiar to all of you, I'm sure. But she made these huge paintings on linen to illustrate his talks. And they are all gorgeous, just like this. She's an artist. And just like Mabel Loomis Todd, actually, who was the artist wife of a science professor who made illustrations that allowed the work to be, and also she wrote to allow the work to be more publicly available. But that's not all. There's also Emma Willard, who founded the Willard School in Troy, New York, who made this visualization of the Temple of History. And there's also Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, who was making these grids based on a Hungarian historian to visualize chronologies in a way that would allow students to imagine multiple events happening in different parts of the world at the same time so that they could tell more personalized, nuanced versions of history. So this portrait allowed a good, someone said earlier the idea of a local example of a bigger phenomenon. Well, here we have an Amherst example of this bigger phenomenon, which is women educators experimenting with data visualization in the period before the Civil War. And so that was one conversation that I was really excited to realize was happening in the collection. Okay, now I'm going to pop into the chat here. Mabel Churchill was a gardener, connection through love of flowers. Oh, this is so great. So you know more about her. I can't wait to know more. Thank you so much, Bonnie. So here's another, so I'm going to tell you a story now. I've told some of you this story already. I was away for a long time this summer. I went to visit my family and came back with COVID. And so I was away for a month in the middle of the summer. And while I was away, my interns were refreshing the flowers that we offered to the portrait of Mabel Loomis Todd on my desk all summer. And they were continuing to be in and out of the house, but I had not been there. And when I walked in, I said, "Hello, house," like I do every time I walk in. And I refreshed the water and the flowers. And I walked around. I said hello to Sally Emerson in the Sally Emerson room. And I was sort of just making the rounds of all of the different rooms. And I saw this new box. And I hadn't noticed it before. And it was on a shelf that I walk past every day. And I pulled it out. And it was a box labeled relics. And I opened it up. And this is what I saw. And it was this box of small fragments of textiles. And I think I had a big exhale and also quite a loud exclamation, because this box is the relics of the grandmothers and great-grandmothers of the women who created the museum. And if it hasn't become clear already, one of the things that is going on in the collection is that it's a conversation happening between women. So I mentioned before that often women's records and handwritten notes aren't as part of the historical story as they could be, even though many of them wrote journals and letters throughout their lives. The Amherst History Museum is, among many other things, a conversation between women about their women ancestors and between their women ancestors, just like I showed with that China set. So this box is a literal instantiation of this. These are the tiny fragments of fabric that these women have left over. These women in the early 20th century had left over from their grandmothers and great-grandmothers who they considered to be mothers of the nation, as well as mothers of their own family. And they turned them into relics by sewing these little handwritten notes onto them. And I'm just going to show some pictures. So the reason why this, all curators and scholars have stories like this. I asked everyone involved with the museum that I knew if they had put that box there, if they'd remembered moving it around while they were cleaning, and no one could remember. I'm sure that there's an explanation, but the explanation that is meaningful here is that I didn't know it was there, and then I did know it was there. And that moment of discovery is something that the house gave me at the time when I was ready for it. And remember when I said about how everyone jokes about the ghosts? This is a common experience of the aliveness of the collection, the agency of the collection. And this isn't an abstract philosophical concept. This is me suddenly having these relics in my hands and knowing that they're doing something together in the museum. I'm just going to show you some of the beautiful detail shots that our photography intern, Danielle Efrat, took over the summer. I have here a grandmother's treasure. And when these go on view in the museum next summer, one of the questions that will accompany them is, what does it mean when someone decides that their family history is the history of their town or their nation? This is birch bark. I don't know what this object is. In my family, we have something called the thing, which is this crocheted silk and like taffeta square, like folding square that is probably from about this period, like the late 19th century. And no one knows what it is, and no one's known what it was for generations. And so we send it to each other as a gag gift on holidays and try to remember who has it and pass it around and call it the thing. And sometimes the usefulness of an object isn't the point. Sometimes it's the fact that we share it or use it for other reasons. This one, I love this. It's got the accounting of the fabric on it. So this is not my grandmother made this. This is an actual, I went to get the fabric for one waist. Ooh, good question about Helen Hunt Jackson. Yeah, could be. We have her, I'm sure you know this, we have her cradle in the collection. And I hope that Helen Hunt Jackson gets more attention in future curatorial endeavors. So this is a very, very worn, almost insubstantial piece of fabric that was part of an apron worn by Mrs. Mattoon. So literally a mother of the Revolution, the mother of General Ebenezer Mattoon. And this is a skein of flax yarn. So, okay, I want to end by talking about another way of bringing objects to life, and that is fun. I think it's really important to, I think one of the words that I've been thinking a lot about this summer is reverence. And I think in a museum, there's sort of a standard repertoire of reverence that we have, maybe silence, maybe not touching things, maybe, I don't know, can anyone else think about reverence and what signifies reverence in a museum or a collection?
Not touching anything.
Yeah, not touching anything. I also think scholarship and exhaustive knowledge and research is an indication of reverence. Time spent on something.
Keeping a distance.
Yeah, maybe keeping a distance. Oh, I got a chat. Behind glass. Yeah, that's another one for sure. So, even that word relic, it has the relationship to reliquary, something that's in a special box, something that you touch a certain way, something that proximity to something else can make sacred, like even touching the object briefly makes the thing that touches it sacred. But I also think that fun is a really important way of bringing life and love and care and use, which we've been talking about, to an object. Like, think of a child toting around his favorite stuffed animal and having a party with it, having a tea party with it. So on my last day of the summer, after consultation with my collections committee, I had a tea party with some of my objects, by which I mean I dressed one of my very good friends in them. and imagine different characters that they might be, and dressed myself and my interns, and got to briefly allow the clothing to feel the touch of skin again. And you know, the idea is that there is a formally curatorial move here, which is we can see photos on present day bodies and know that that was a one-time thing and the photos will become the record. But there was also, like I said, a real sense of play and fun in this that I think the idea of reverence often doesn't allow. And I don't think that play and fun necessarily have to be about making something more casual or less important. Instead, again, thinking about a child's play and how it allows the thing to be the highest version of itself. When a child plays with the toy and imagines that it's speaking to him or her, that thing is given more presence, is given more value than the just being sort of passive and mute. And that's something that I really wanted to explore. And so I'm very grateful that I got the chance to do this. And the results are fun, and there's more, and I hope more happens. And some of these photos will be on view with a little try-on rack of clothing in the museum when we reopen next year. So those are all of the prepared things that I wanted to talk about. I know we're at 1 o'clock. So anyone who has to go back to another thing, thank you so much for joining me. I'm gonna turn off my slideshow because anyone who wants to stay and chat, I would love to hear both your thoughts on everything that we've been talking about, but also if there's objects in your life that you've experienced this kind of love and use for, whether you gave the love and use or someone else did. And it could just be special objects. This is whenever I lead a workshop or give a presentation, I'm always researching too. So I want to hear from you about what objects have been coming to mind as I've been talking about objects in the collection. Is that Lisa?
This isn't really directly to your question, but I at least did not grow up in Amherst. And many of us, probably most of us who live in Amherst now, did not. I got fascinated by the history because I like the place. I'm guessing that's true of other people, but I am curious, why, how long people have been here and why interest in history, etc.
Well, I've been living here for close to 45 years. I did not grow up here. I have some family connections with the area, but my older brother went to college here and I would come out and visit him, and I just fell in love with the area. Mm-hmm. And after 45 years, you can feel a connection with the history of a place, especially when you've heard your grandfather talk about some stuff. And as a storyteller, I'm interested in collecting the stories of the place.
Mm-hmm.
Elisa, where did you grow up?
Arlington, Virginia. And I came here to be a student at UMass. I had no other connection to the place, but I had spent 2 years in Illinois before that as a grad student. And I was so happy to be back where the land goes up and down and there are rocks and trees. I moved into a rented room in a house, where as a grad student. And then I walked, as soon as I got my stuff in there, I walked through town. I got on the Amherst College campus and looked at that view. And I thought, oh my goodness, I am not in Illinois anymore. This is great. So.
And how do you collect a view, right? Like you can collect pictures of a view.
Yeah.
But that's a really good example of a town attribute that you can only kind of get at. You can't actually have it.
Right. Somewhere I do have photos of that mountain range before the mountain that used to be next to the notch became people's driveways and roads, and was taken down by the company that still runs a quarry there. Anyway.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from anyone. Oh, Fiona, I just noticed your hand. Sorry.
So I just had a couple of comments that I wanted to make. That kudos to you right off the bat, because Mabel, who helped found the Historical Society, was a very sassy broad, and she would have loved the costume slideshow that you presented.
That's me.
I know
that's
that she
me
enjoyed.
In her cape.
Oh, is it really? Okay, yeah. Gotcha. It's because I know in the collection there was a lot of stuff where Mabel partook in costume parties herself, and it was a very sort of something that they did, including to raise funds and so on. So I think full circle, I think it's wonderful that that you took the opportunity to do that with I would have been horrified if somebody was wearing Emily's dress, but that aside, I think it's a fun way to use the collection and to have fun with it. And I was honored to be with the Historical Society and actually be a curator at the Society for a few years, a long time ago. But having fun was something that was always important, and I think really helped in telling some of the stories. Taking kids through Mrs. Emerson's room, they've never seen a potty, never mind an embroidered one, and having back and forth with kids in particular, I had a lot of fun with the museum. But it really is important that they see the museum and are asked questions and asked to be part of that experience. And so I think I've been following your tweets over the summer and some of the Facebook posts and that kind of thing. And it's very fun to see energy and color coming out of the museum, because we are so often reverent, as you also brought up, in that process. And so I just think it's fun. I'm not, there are a lot of things in the collection that do need to be behind glass or be protected at a greater level than some others, but to be able to interact with things one-on-one with students and visitors is very fun. So it's nice to see that you're doing that and that you've got an active internship program going, and that they're being encouraged to explore themselves too, not just told what the story is. So kudos, and this was a nice presentation.
That's Zoom Life. Thank you so much. This is so cool to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Are you in Amherst now, or are you from?
No, I'm in Northampton. I live over in Northampton in an old 1785 farmhouse. So I know and loved being in the Strong House, and know about, no straight corners and leaky roofs and funny floors, and loved being with the Strong House and was honored to be there with the Historical Society for a number of years. But no, I'm over in my own old farmhouse. So.
Well, that was something that I didn't get to bring up, but I really appreciate you did, the idea of the house as sort of as an object.
Absolutely.
The house is one of the alive things in the collection, right?
Exactly.
The house, like you said, creaks. The house has shifting corners. The house actually moves and grows and changes over time. The house is in relationship with the root system of a huge sycamore tree. The house is in relationship with the dirt, so I love that you brought that up, because you can't think about any of this without thinking about the aliveness of the building itself.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a wonderful building, and we got to do a lot of work on it during the time I was there. We did rebuild the chimney completely as part of a program that we were able to secure some CPA funds for. But that house is, I have very fond memories of that house, and I would always walk in the house, and you mentioned you say hello house. I said hello to Mrs. Emerson every morning. I thought that was good juju on my part, was to just keep Mrs. Emerson cool. I'm here, it's just me. You know, I'd be like, it's just me, Fiona, when I would go up the stairs.
Yeah, right. And that's it. Like that's the stuff that doesn't make it into the books, right? It's sort of, these are the practices. We all do them because we feel that they're necessary or important. And and I so appreciate hearing you say that, because, you know, you do it.
You definitely,
Yeah. And I think also your idea about, you mentioning kids, and, you know, one of the ways you use and love a building is by having bodies in it.
Right.
And by having feet thundering upstairs.
Exactly.
One of the visiting scholars that we brought in this summer is a young postdoc who studies 18th century homes named Kaylin Carbonell, who talks about the sound experience of an 18th century house, and how they're noisy, and how you might hear people that you don't see. And that the actual feeling and presence of bodies in an old house would be really different. So there's another idea of reverence, right? Solitude is part of our idea of reverence, maybe the one-on-one experience with an object or a place. But you know, a group of kids looking at Mrs. Emerson's room is a different way of thinking about that. So thank you so much for bringing those things up. That's like perfect. And again, thank you for your service to the house. Who else has something that they want to share about an object, about a house they've lived in, about the Strong House or Amherst? I want to learn from you. Lou?
Hi, I just wanted, well, thank you. This has been a wonderful discussion. I'm not from Amherst, I'm from Bulgaria, but I feel like I am because I've been following pictures of the place since I was 14, when my mother was here as a student at UMass. And I came to live here because I love the place and the historic society and the library next to it, and all the information about the life of the place always connects to me to a friend that I have who's 99 years old and who's lived in this town all these years, and who was sort of my anchor, and her family is my anchor here in town. And her stories about growing up in North Amherst and the small schoolhouse where she went to school, the trolley bus. I mean, it just really animated for me the landscape that I got to know as a teenager, and then as a sort of a professional when I came to work here at UMass almost 25 years ago. So this place is so rich with history and with people who know it and have lived it and are engaged in civic life. I think there's a really important sort of ongoing civic life connection between the members of the town and the organizations, and they support the organizations wholeheartedly so that they're loved in that respect. It's like the organizations in town are loved just like the objects and the buildings. And to answer your question, my family and I lived in Brooklyn for a while, and there was a lovely house museum in the connected to the botanical garden in Park Slope, or in the it was connected to the Brooklyn's Central Park ultimately, and they would have toys, 19th century toys for children to play with, the hoops in particular with the sticks that you could throw to each other, and connected it to photos of people doing that activity. And my children used to love that. We had a pair of those hoops in our household, and I think there are at least 3 generations of kids that have played with those tools. I think that kind of play for young people with objects that are either reconstructions or connect to objects in the museum is a wonderful way to connect to life over generations, and I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing out, well, first of all, thank you for your story. And thank you also for bringing out this, this idea of being connected to a place over a long period of time, and how being connected to a collection and a place, like your relationship with it grows and changes as you grow and change, and as the place grows and changes. And it's interesting to think about the role of that, the role of an institution or a collection in that growing and changing, because it's not the same kind of organic growth and change of each person making their own individual choice for their own home, or each business owner, you know, opening their business or closing their business. Of course, there's oversight by a town, but in a collection, it's not quite the same. And so it's a different perspective on changeover. We talked about change over time earlier, which of course, like, is what a historian's job is to think about, to ask questions about change over time. And so you brought up another idea, you know, your relationship with someone else who's been around for another time that you weren't there for, you having children who you know, see things a different way. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, I do think that it connects to objects and buildings in particular connect to organizations in ways that can both live and die. You know, a building will die if the institution or the organization that owned it is no longer around. I was partnering with George and the Historic Society and Marla in doing Brute Bites about the concrete brutalist buildings on our UMass Amherst campus, because they are now reaching, and they're actually younger than me, but very close to my age. So I now am a historian just by the fact that I'm older, and these buildings too are now becoming part of history because they've survived this long. And the concrete buildings that I grew up with as a child in Bulgaria are in very bad shape. They're really deteriorating. And part of that is because the civic institutions that originally built them are frayed and no longer really living well. And so my work here is connected to maintaining the public sphere and the institution, but also articulating the love and care that we need to continue putting into them and stewarding them. So it's even more complicated with a very large concrete structure than it is with a home, but the sense of belonging and ownership and stewardship comes from our knowledge and love of the home where we grow up, or the house as a residential sort of locus of feelings about belonging. So it's a complex issue, but history and a historic society and a collection makes it palpable and possible to have these conversations.
Yeah, I want to just say one more thing you flagged, is this idea that, like, knowing about something is one of the things that supports the caring for it. So if you know the story, or a story, you know, the story can be different for different objects. It might be, I know the story of its making, or I know the story of its giving, having been given from one person to another person to another person. But knowing something about an object is an important step or catalyst for that care and love. And that's a really important thing.
There's an object I want to mention to you that to me has a huge amount of meaning. And I recently lost connection to it. It's the book that is maintained by the election clerk at North Amherst. I happened to volunteer for the elections. And there used to be a book where the clerk wrote the notes from every election. And when I first came, I knew a lot of women who were part of that community. And so when I first became a clerk and started writing notes in that book, it was extraordinarily meaningful to look back and to see all the previous years and all the names, and to know all these people who were part of this community. And it recently was replaced by a new book. So somewhere in town, there is a book that has the names of all of the women and men, a lot of them were women actually that I knew. So whenever, if I see it in a museum or in the Historic Society Museum, I would be very, very pleased to be able to see it and look through it. Actually, that's one of those things where you want it beyond the glass.
Thank you. That sounds like an amazing object.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was wonderful.
Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
And thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation.